The sky cracked open above Berlin on the 6th of March, 1944, and Hermann Göring's world shattered with it. Standing at the window of his hunting lodge at Hall, 40 miles north of the capital, the Reichsmarschall watched silver contrails etch themselves across the afternoon sky. Thin, deliberate, impossibly high. His hand, adorned with rings looted from half of Europe, trembled against the cold glass. Those were not German trails. The Americans had been bombing the Reich for months, but always their fighters had turned back at the border, leaving the bombers vulnerable, bleeding. Not today. Today, the escorts had followed their charges all the way to the heart of the Third Reich. Göring had built his reputation on one ironclad promise: no enemy aircraft would ever fly over Germany. Now, watching those white lines cross directly above the Reichstag, above the Brandenburg Gate, above everything he had sworn to protect, he understood with absolute clarity that the war was over. 4 years earlier, in the intoxicating spring of 1940, Göring had stood before newsreel cameras and made his famous boast. "If enemy bombers ever reach the Ruhr," he had declared, his chest glittering with medals, "my name is not Hermann Göring. You can call me Meier." It was the kind of theatrical pronouncement that suited him perfectly, bold, memorable, and at the time entirely reasonable. The Luftwaffe had swept aside the Polish Air Force in 18 days. French and British planes fell from the sky like clay pigeons. German pilots were gods, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs the instruments of an unstoppable will. The Reich stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, from Norway to North Africa, and over all of it, German aircraft ruled absolutely. The mathematics of air warfare in 1940 through 1943 had seemed to favor the defender. American B-17 and B-24 bombers could carry devastating bomb loads deep into occupied Europe, but their escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts primarily, could only accompany them part way before running out of fuel. The internal fuel capacity of a P-47 gave it a combat radius of roughly 450 miles. Berlin lay 580 miles from the nearest Allied airfields in England. The gap was not merely tactical, it was absolute, mathematical, final. For 3 bloody years, American bomber crews had paid for that gap in blood. The numbers told a story of industrial-scale slaughter. In October of 1943, during what became known as Black Week, the United States 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers in 7 days. Each bomber carried 10 men. Nearly 1,500 air crews, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, killed or captured in a single week. The raid on Schweinfurt on October 14th cost 60 B-17s out of 291 that departed England. A 20% loss rate was mathematically unsustainable. Lose 20% of your force on each mission, and within 5 missions, you have no force left. The men knew the mathematics. They climbed into their aircraft anyway, breathing oxygen through rubber masks in negative 40-degree cold, watching their friends explode in mid-air, knowing that statistically they were already dead. German fighter tactics had evolved into a brutal science. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters and Messerschmitt 109s would wait just beyond the range of American escorts, circling like sharks beyond the reef. The moment the P-47s turned back, and they always turned back, their fuel gauges approaching empty, the German fighters would close in. They attacked in waves, coming at the bombers head-on at combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. A 2-second burst from a Focke-Wulf's 20mm cannons could tear a B-17's wing off. The bombers flew in tight formations called combat boxes, their 50-caliber machine guns creating overlapping fields of fire, but it was never enough. The sky would fill with metal and fire, parachutes blossoming white against the gray European winter, burning men falling 5 miles to earth. The technological solution seemed impossible. To escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back required a fighter with a combat radius exceeding 600 miles, double what existing American fighters could achieve. It would need to be fast enough to match German interceptors, maneuverable enough to dogfight, and powerful enough to protect the bombers while carrying enormous fuel loads. The weight of additional fuel would slow any aircraft, making it vulnerable. The engineering problem appeared insoluble. Multiple American aircraft manufacturers had tried and failed. The P-38 Lightning had range, but lacked maneuverability at high altitude. The P-47 could fight, but could not reach. The British Spitfire, elegant and deadly, was a short-range interceptor. The gap remained. Then came an aircraft that should never have existed, born from a combination of British desperation, American engineering, and pure bureaucratic accident. North American Aviation received a British Purchasing Commission request in April 1940 to manufacture P-40 fighters under license. The company's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, a German immigrant who had fled the Nazis in 1930, responded with characteristic audacity, "Give us 120 days, and we will design something better." The British, skeptical but desperate, agreed. Schmood's team worked around the clock, 7 days a week. They incorporated the laminar flow wing technology that reduced drag by 40%, matched it with the powerful American Allison engine, and created an airframe that was both strong and surprisingly light. The prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 102 days after the contract was signed. The first Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, performed brilliantly at low altitude, but struggled above 15,000 feet, where the bombers flew and fought. For 2 years, the aircraft served in ground attack roles, fast and capable, but not the solution anyone needed. Then, in 1942, someone, accounts differ on exactly who deserves credit, had the idea of replacing the Allison with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire. The Merlin, with its 2-stage supercharger, maintained power at high altitude. The marriage of British engine and American airframe created something unprecedented. A fighter that was faster than a Focke-Wulf 190, more maneuverable than a Messerschmitt 109, and capable of carrying enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back. The breakthrough in range came from an almost comically simple innovation: disposable external fuel tanks. The concept was not new. Japanese Zero fighters had used them since 1941, but American engineers perfected the design. 2 teardrop-shaped tanks, each holding 108 gallons of fuel, mounted under the Mustang's wings. The pilot could jettison them when entering combat, restoring the aircraft's full performance. With internal and external tanks combined, a P-51 Mustang could carry 490 gallons of fuel. At cruising speed, that gave it a combat radius of 750 miles. Berlin was no longer beyond reach. The first operational Mustang groups arrived in England in December 1943. Their pilots were young, most in their early 20s, trained in the vast blue skies over Texas and Arizona, now preparing to fight in the gray industrial theater of total war over Europe. They painted the noses of their aircraft with shark teeth and pin-up girls, gave them names like Lou the Fourth and Glamorous Glenn, trying to personalize machines designed for industrial killing. They studied gun camera footage of German tactics, memorized the profiles of enemy aircraft, practiced aerial gunnery until the choreography of pursuit and deflection became instinct. They knew they were about to attempt something that had never been done: escort heavy bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and bring them home. The first long-range escort mission to Berlin was scheduled for the 4th of March, 1944. Weather forced a scrub. The second attempt, on the 6th, launched under marginal conditions. 814 heavy bombers lifted off from English airfields, their 4 engines roaring, carrying enough explosive power to level city blocks. Flying escort were 174 P-51 Mustangs of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups, the 354th, the 357th, the 300th, and the 363rd. Their orders were unprecedented in simplicity and in ambition. Take the bombers to Berlin, fight off the Luftwaffe, bring everyone home. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group crossed the German border at 27,000 feet, leading his squadron into what the intelligence briefings had promised would be the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The sky was crystalline at that altitude, cold enough that moisture in the cockpit would freeze instantly on any metal surface. Below, Germany spread out like a map, rivers, silver threads, cities, dark smudges, the whole industrial heart of the Third Reich laid bare. Howard scanned the horizon, knowing that somewhere in that vast sky, German fighters were already scrambling, racing to intercept. The bombers flew in their combat boxes, steady and inexorable, and for the first time in the history of the air war over Europe, their escorts flew beside them all the way. The German reaction revealed the depth of their shock. Luftwaffe pilots, expecting the American fighters to turn back as they always did, instead found themselves engaged in running dogfights over Brandenburg, over Pomerania, over Berlin itself. The combat reports from that day read like fever dreams. Howard, separated from his squadron, single-handedly attacked a formation of 30 German fighters threatening a bomber group, destroying multiple enemy aircraft in a one-man holding action that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Other Mustang pilots pursued German interceptors all the way down to ground level, shooting them out of the sky as they tried to land and refuel. The mathematics of attrition had reversed. German fighters, which once swarmed bombers with impunity, now faced a terrible choice: engage the escorts and burn fuel in extended combat, or conserve fuel and watch the bombers pass untouched. On the ground in Berlin, civilians who had learned to recognize the deep thunder of approaching bomber formations heard something new that day: the higher-pitched snarl of fighter engines directly overhead, the staccato bark of machine guns and cannons in aerial combat above the city itself. For 4 years, Nazi propaganda had assured them that German air defenses were impenetrable, that the fatherland was protected by the finest air force in the world. Now they watched American fighters chase German planes across the sky above the Tiergarten, above the government quarter, above their homes. The contrails of dogfights etched white spirals against the blue. Some citizens stopped to watch, others ran for shelters, and some stood frozen, understanding that they were witnessing the visible collapse of a promise that had sustained them through years of war. At Carenhall, Göring received the combat reports with the numb horror of a man watching his own execution. His staff officers, reading the teletype messages, spoke in hushed tones of impossible American penetration, of escorts over the capital, of running air battles above Berlin itself. The numbers were devastating. The Luftwaffe had engaged in hundreds of individual combats, but had failed to prevent the majority of bombers from reaching their targets. More critically, German fighter losses were unsustainable. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Each veteran lost meant not just one death, but the deletion of years of accumulated combat experience. The Americans, by contrast, had pilots and aircraft in seemingly endless supply. Their training programs turned out thousands of qualified pilots every month. Their factories produced over 2,000 P-51 Mustangs every month. The industrial arithmetic was merciless. Göring had built his career on spectacle and bombast, on the theatrical cultivation of his image as the Reich's warrior prince. He wore uniforms designed by famous tailors, decorated with medals both earned and invented. His appetite for luxury was legendary: art looted from occupied territories, jewels, narcotic painkillers, feasts that would have fed a battalion. But beneath the peacock display, he understood air power with the instinct of a genuine combat pilot from the First World War. He had flown with Richthofen's flying circus, had shot down enemy aircraft in the thin canvas biplanes of that earlier war, knew the mathematics of fuel and ammunition and altitude. Watching those American contrails over Berlin, he performed a mental calculation that admitted no ambiguity. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere in Germany. Every factory, every airfield, every city was now exposed. The defensive advantage that had made the Reich's airspace a killing ground for Allied bombers had evaporated in a single afternoon. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was immediate and corrosive. For 3 years, they had owned the sky deep over Germany. They had attacked bomber formations with the confidence of predators assured of their superiority once the escorts turned back. Now, suddenly, they were the hunted. The Mustang was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 above 20,000 feet, more maneuverable than the Messerschmitt 109 at all altitudes, and present in increasing numbers on every mission. Worse, American pilots were employing new tactics, freed by their aircraft's range, to hunt aggressively rather than simply escort defensively. They would drop their external tanks, then sweep ahead of the bomber formations, seeking out German fighters before they could organize their attacks. The predator had become prey. The transformation of the air war accelerated with brutal speed over the following months. In April of 1944, the 8th Air Force flew 21 major bombing missions into Germany. Mustangs escorted all of them. In May, the number rose to 27. Bomber losses, which had been catastrophic in late 1943, fell dramatically. In January 1944, before the Mustang arrived in force, the 8th Air Force lost 264 heavy bombers. By April, that number had dropped to 136, even as the number of missions increased. The calculus of survival had shifted. Bomber crews, who had calculated their life expectancy in single-digit missions, began to believe they might complete their required 25 mission tours and go home. General Carl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, recognized the Mustang's arrival as a strategic inflection point. In a meeting with his staff on March 10th, 4 days after the first Berlin escort mission, he issued new directives. American fighters were no longer to remain tied to the bomber formations. Their primary mission was now to destroy the Luftwaffe, in the air, on the ground, wherever they could be found. The orders effectively transformed the 8th Air Force's fighter groups into an offensive weapon aimed at achieving air supremacy through attrition. Hunt them, kill them, destroy their ability to resist. The directive unleashed a campaign of aerial warfare unlike anything previously attempted. Mustang pilots began strafing German airfields, catching fighters on the ground during takeoff and landing, destroying them in their revetments. They shot up trains, trucks, barges, anything that moved. They flew ground attack missions that would have been suicidal earlier in the war, but were now possible because the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the sky. The destruction was methodical and comprehensive. By June of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over Western Europe. On D-Day, the 6th of June, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy under an umbrella of total air supremacy. German pilots who attempted to intervene were shot down so quickly that most Wehrmacht soldiers fighting on the ground never saw a German aircraft. The technological and tactical victory had a human dimension that transcended statistics. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, the pilot who had single-handedly fought off 30 German fighters over Berlin on that first escort mission, received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. His citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy over Germany." But Howard himself, in later interviews, always spoke not of heroism, but of mathematics and fuel management, of the simple fact that his P-51 had enough gas to stay in the fight while German pilots ran their tanks dry. The Mustang had given him options that earlier fighters could not provide. He had used those options to protect the bombers. The rest was simply combat. For Göring, the collapse of the Luftwaffe meant the collapse of his position within the Nazi hierarchy. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, blamed him for the Air Force's failure to protect German cities. In a meeting in late 1944, Hitler reportedly screamed at Göring for nearly an hour, accusing him of incompetence and cowardice. Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, withdrew into increasing drug dependence and irrelevance. He would later tell interrogators after the war that the moment he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew Germany had lost. It was not merely a tactical defeat, but a psychological one. The promise that had sustained German morale, that their homeland was protected, that the Luftwaffe would shield them from the consequences of the war they had cheered, had proven to be a lie written in contrails across the Berlin sky. The strategic consequences rippled outward like shock waves. German aircraft production actually increased in 1944, reaching levels higher than any previous year. Over 40,000 planes built in the face of constant bombing. But production was meaningless without pilots to fly them or fuel to power them. The Luftwaffe's training program had collapsed. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with perhaps 20 hours of flight time, facing American pilots with 10 times that experience. They died quickly, usually within their first few missions. The veterans who remained were exhausted, flying multiple sorties per day against impossible odds, watching their comrades burn, knowing they were next. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Aircraft sat on airfields, mechanically perfect, tanks empty. Allied intelligence officers, analyzing captured German documents after the war, found evidence of the demoralization in stark detail. Unit diaries recorded declining pilot morale, increasing rates of combat refusal, pilots reporting phantom mechanical problems to avoid missions. Letters home, intercepted by sensors, spoke of exhaustion and despair. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated in July of 1944, told his interrogators, "We used to own the sky. Now we die there." The loss of air superiority had a cascading effect on German military capability across all theaters. Without air cover, German armored formations became vulnerable to air attack. Supply columns were strafed. Rail lines were bombed. The entire logistical network that sustained the Wehrmacht came under relentless pressure from aircraft that could range at will across German-controlled territory. The architects of the Mustang, Edgar Schmood and his team at North American Aviation, never sought glory for their creation. Schmood, the German émigré who had designed the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe, rarely gave interviews, preferring to let the engineering speak for itself. In one post-war conversation, he noted that the P-51 was never intended to be a miracle weapon. It was simply the result of careful engineering, of matching the right engine to the right airframe, of solving the fuel capacity problem with external tanks. The aircraft succeeded because it was designed to do one thing: escort bombers to any target in Europe and back. And it did that thing better than any other fighter in existence. Simplicity of purpose, executed with precision. For the bomber crews who flew under Mustang escort, the change was salvation made visible. Ball turret gunners, cramped in their tiny spherical compartments beneath the aircraft, no longer spent entire missions scanning for German fighters with the certain knowledge that once the escorts turned back, they were exposed. Tail gunners, who bore the brunt of German rear attacks, found themselves with covering fire from American fighters that pursued enemy interceptors rather than simply reacting to them. The casualty rates told the story. Bomber crew survival rates increased dramatically from March 1944 onward. Men who had written goodbye letters before every mission began to believe they might survive. The presence of Mustangs, silver aircraft with distinctive checkered patterns, or red tails flown by the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group, or the green-nosed fighters of the 352nd, became synonymous with hope. The air war over Europe in 1944 and 1945 was not won by a single aircraft or a single innovation. It was won by industrial capacity, by pilot training, by tactics and doctrine, by the accumulated weight of Allied resources directed toward a single goal. But within that vast campaign, the P-51 Mustang served as the instrument that transformed possibility into reality. It gave American bombers the ability to strike anywhere in German-controlled Europe with escort protection. It gave American pilots an aircraft that could fight German fighters on equal or better terms. It gave Allied commanders the tool they needed to achieve air supremacy, which in turn enabled the ground campaigns that defeated Germany. The Mustang was not merely a fighter aircraft. It was a strategic weapon that changed the fundamental calculus of the air war. By April of 1945, with Berlin surrounded by Soviet forces and the Third Reich reduced to rubble, Göring sat in his cell at Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, awaiting trial. Allied interrogators asked him when he knew Germany would lose the war. His answer, recorded in multiple interrogation reports, returned always to that moment at Karen Hall in March of 1944. "When I saw American escort fighters over Berlin," he said, "I knew the jig was up." It was not the bombers that broke him, not the tonnage of explosives dropped on German cities. It was the sight of those silver Mustangs, flying where they should never have been able to reach, rendering his promises hollow and his air force impotent. The contrails over Berlin had written an ending that no amount of propaganda could obscure. The men who flew those first missions to Berlin and back aged into veterans, then old men, then memories. They gathered at reunions, recognizing each other by squadron patches and the shared vocabulary of combat. Bounce, bandit, angels, deck. They had been 20 years old when they escorted bombers over Berlin, young enough to believe they were immortal even as their friends died around them. They became teachers, engineers, businessmen, fathers, grandfathers, carrying with them always the knowledge that they had done something that mattered, that the missions they flew had shortened a war and saved lives. The P-51 Mustangs they had flown ended up in museums, restored to gleaming perfection, engines silent, guns empty, beautiful and deadly and obsolete, artifacts of a war that had demanded everything and received it. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany remains controversial among historians, its effectiveness debated, its moral implications questioned. But the contribution of the Mustang to Allied victory admits no ambiguity. It solved the unsolvable problem. It gave bomber crews a fighting chance. It broke the Luftwaffe's grip on the sky over Europe, and on a cold afternoon in March of 1944, it announced its arrival with silver contrails over Berlin, visible proof that promises made in hubris could be broken by engineering precision and pilot courage. Hermann Göring saw those contrails and understood. The war was over. Everything that followed was merely the settling of accounts.